Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Stan Snyder, and thus far I have tried to present a kind of outside-in, high-level lens on social change with guests who have observed the various dynamics at play from their perches in journalism, philanthropy, formational institutional leadership, and other key leverage points. I view these national structural lenses as vital to understanding the machinations that must be deployed when a prophetic vision is unleashed. And I imagine that most of the time, when we hear the phrase social change, a lot of us assume that those responsible for turning the most powerful wheels of any given movement work in these kinds of high-up driver seats. In a way, I think we outsource our unspoken longings to the, quote, professionals. But if we look carefully at history and we're honest about the social change that has most inspired us, we cannot help but also see that real, powerfully redemptive, large-scale change always begins with a conversion of sight, of soul, and then of willpower and life. There is something inescapably personal, costly, and all-in pervading history's most successful social movements. As one of our authors in this spring issue, Luke Bretherton, writes, quote, "Any meaningful change that generates moral and political renewal, involves a movement from the world as it is to the world as it should be. Conversion is another term for this kind of change, one that has ancient roots." Today, I'd like to introduce you to a couple whose writing, witness, and friendship to me over the years have illuminated this more intimate insight with a kind of stunning integrity. And with that integrity, just grace upon grace. Amber and David Lapp remind me of Dorothy Day, of moving one's feet in the arrow of what contemporary reality and the pain and division often embedded in that reality is calling forth out of those of us whose minds and hearts have been transformed by an encounter with perfect love. They have chosen not just to study one of the thorniest problems in contemporary life in the West, namely loneliness and distrust, but rather to dive into that fearsome morass, going to where the pain is and living there, bearing children, being neighbors, learning how to be students, and embodying the mature insight that transformational writing and study of a problem must require one big yes, an abnegation of self, a living with. I'm honored to get to share them with you today. I view the Lapps as a national treasure, even though they are wonderfully relatable, humble human beings. They live in Ohio. They have 6 children, the youngest born just a little while ago, and they are both research fellows at the Institute for Family Studies, and David is also a co-founder of Braver Angels, in my view, one of the smartest and most effective depolarization organizations in the U.S. Amber, David, it's so fun to see you. Thank you for joining the Whole Person Revolution.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here. Yeah.
Thank you for your very kind words, Anne. We're glad to be here.
Thank you. So I wanted to set the stage in that introduction with character over plotline, and I'm guessing that some of our listeners are maybe officially intrigued, but also frustrated with me, like, Anne, just tell us about their actual autobiography, like their geographic coordinates, the resume. But somehow I just wanted you two to share a bit of your story in your own words. As I said, you've made what I think of as inspiring, discerning the times type life choices, and perhaps especially given your educational background. So could you just welcome our listeners into your own sort of vocational path and enunciation moment? What has been a bit of your journey, and where are you now?
Yes. Well, our journey together began at a small Christian college in New York City, the King's College. So we were both students there studying politics, philosophy, and economics, and began dating there. And about our senior year, both began to be very interested in marriage and family issues, the theology of marriage and family. And so it was one of my first job out of college was working for this small think tank that no longer exists, but called the Institute for American Values, founded by David Blankenhorn, that did a lot of work studying marriage, family, fatherhood, from about the late 1980s to the late 2000s. And it did a lot of really important work. And so I began as a research assistant there. And so eventually what would happen is, we settled in a working class town and really saw our mission as helping to strengthen the working class, living in solidarity with the working class. But when we first began at the Institute for American Values, the working class was not on our minds.
The two of us had really bonded. David and I, when we started dating, we had the experience of learning about John Paul II's theology of the body. We weren't Catholic at the time, but I would say that one of the things that brought David and I together was this kind of experience of falling in love with human love, which is something that John Paul II had said of himself. And so we always thought that perhaps our vocation together was to strengthen marriage and families. And so that's where it started. David Blankenhorn had asked David if he would know anybody that was interested in doing a research project in the Midwest to look at the qualitative side of the marriage gap, that, marriage trends were bifurcating across class lines. And David told him, no, not really. I'm not sure. And then he came home and talked to me. And I said, actually, I think we would love to do that. I'm from Ohio myself, and it was an intriguing project. But before that, we hadn't really thought much about inequality or the working class.
Yeah, so it's basically being given this opportunity to go to a working class town in Ohio, white working class town, and go door to door and ask people if they'd be willing to sit down, for interview and let us ask them about their stories of growing up and forming families and relationships and what they think about marriage. And so as a result of, we did over 100 interviews, and it was meant to be this is in the summer of 2010. So this is about 2 years before Charles Murray's Coming Apart book is written, which did a lot to highlight this growing class divide. But it was beginning to be on the minds of, some public intellectuals and academics. And our job was to shed some personal, what are the stories behind the stats here? And so that's what launched us into, what is now what we think of as our vocation. But at the time, we were just, it was a fun research project for us for 3 months living in working class Ohio.
You did not anticipate it necessarily being a long-term thing.
No, we were going to write a report and then be done with it and stay in New York City where our friends were and our community was. But then we found ourselves, after we moved back to the city, feeling very unsettled by the stories we had heard, especially just the commonplaceness of trauma. But we also felt very drawn in and almost invited, really, to continue the conversation with the people that we had interviewed. And so we thought, let's go back the next summer and do follow-up interviews. And it was after that we discerned that we wanted to, even more than just one trip, we wanted to actually move there and stay. At the time, we thought, maybe for a few years before we go on to grad school or something. But as you can see, here we are 13 years later. And I think part of that was because in the interviews that we did, we were struck by how many people were so grateful. Many people told us, I've never told anyone these things. They were really trusting us with something that was very precious. And at the end of some interviews, David, you should share what Rob had mentioned to you.
Yeah. So I was talking with this young father, Rob, he was a roofer at the time, and he had 2 kids, and he and his girlfriend had met when they were in high school. They were 15 years old, and then had their first baby when she was 16, and then their second one in her later teen years. And they loved each other very much, but they had an on and off relationship. And both of them came from divorced families and, vowed to themselves that they wanted to have a lifelong marriage and create the kind of stable family that they didn't have growing up. And so the strong declarations and earnestness and intentions were there, but, they had money troubles. They were young, a lot of just different stressors. And they were finding it difficult to stay together. And so we went to the local bar, and I had this, long 2+ hour conversation with Rob, asking him all these questions. And at the end of it, he says to me, and we're about to leave, and he says, "No, wait a minute. I want to know what you think about love and marriage. I want to hear your side of the story. So that was, whoa, wait a minute. We're just the researchers here. You're not supposed to ask that, right? But it was moments like that when we felt like there was this calling and this invitation to something more than being researchers, and that is to be neighbors, and that is to be fellow citizens, to live with people who are experiencing these issues, and to see what we can do together to address the challenge.
It struck us that if the crisis is personal, the solution has to be personal. And so
it's just a really sobering, the overwhelming amount of trauma is just so really sobering. And because of that trauma, the difficulties forming trusting relationships, whether it's I don't trust my girlfriend, or I don't trust my neighbor, or I don't trust my employer, or I don't trust the government. And it just seemed to us that became really the focal point of our inquiry then, was this pervasive sense of distrust, and thinking about, wow, I mean, so you form distrust because of personal experiences. And so it seems to be that the way to build trust has to include a deeply personal encounter.
Could you give a little texture to some of that trauma? What is the nature of it?
I think, some of the obvious things that come to mind would be abuse, whether physical, sexual, or emotional. A lot of just very chaotic upbringings, both in the relationships that they witnessed between their parents and subsequent. I mean, what comes to mind is the idea of the revolving door of relationships, or the marriage go round that Andrew Cherlin wrote about. Just a lot of instability in relationships. Poverty, yes, although I think really it was the relational poverty that we heard the most about. And not to say that doesn't have roots in some economic stressors as well. But then there was often the trauma was perpetuated as these young adults were coming of age and forming their own relationships. And despite their sincerest intentions, were repeating the patterns of their parents. So I remember one woman who grew up, spent some time in a homeless shelter with her mom, and then was ultimately raised by her parents. But then she found herself in a similarly unstable situation, using drugs and in jeopardy of losing her kids. And she said to me, I don't know how I became my mom. So it was those sorts of cycles that were just heartbreaking to watch, because there was an awareness on the part of the people, but that they were in this pattern, but a feeling of helplessness that, like, I don't know how to stop this.
Mm-hmm. And another window into this is there's a friend of mine whom I became close to, and his name is Tyler. And Tyler, he was abused by his father growing up, and his parents, divorced early in his childhood. And then by the time he's 15, 16 years old, he's really just looking for love, because he feels like he's never really experienced, stable love. And he becomes very close he has a girlfriend. And, but then one day on the bus, they're about to go to the stop where his girlfriend lives, and he sees EMT trucks and police there, and he's wondering what's going on. And here she had overdosed. And then that sent him into a cycle of, as he says, just trying to numb the pain, going on meth and other drugs. And then by the time he meets his next girlfriend, whom he has his first baby with, he vows that they're going to, that they're going to have this stable family that he didn't have growing up. But he also felt like the demons of the past and like anger from his growing up years was just, he didn't know how to escape that. And he had tried seeing a therapist, but as he told me, the therapist said that I have a personality of a serial killer. And so he didn't trust therapists. And he only went to go see a therapist one time if I went with him, on the condition that I went with him, because he trusted me. And so it was those kinds of experiences where Tyler's saying, yeah, I'll go visit the therapist, but if you go with me, because I don't trust therapists.
I think it's such a pattern of human experience, and particularly those of us who feel so lucky to be able to say we're kind of living into our calling, whatever we're doing, all, up and down the quote, the sort of modern social class ladder, to sort of look back and be able to say, I originally made a choice. In your case, we originally went to Ohio for a 3-month research project, and it's a little meta because you're falling in love with human love in a way you were drawn. You continue to be drawn towards a more full, all-in, some might say radical solidarity with those who didn't have your exact cultural and other pieces of your background. And I love that. I'm sure you've mapped that onto certain historic philosophies of personalism, and so on, about what it actually means to live with. But I won't assume that it was always, or it has always been easy to be initially a bit of an outsider. And Amber, I know you are from Ohio, but to sort of come from having a fancy degree from a fancy city on the East Coast, and then to go in initially as somewhat outsiders in the form of asking questions. Would you mind sharing a little bit your own journey of probably how you've changed and adjusted both perhaps some of your communicative and tonal ways and means of relating, but also the unconscious process of becoming part of a subcontext and a culture, and what it is to actually along the way discover your mutual humanity, your shared brokenness, your shared longings, all of that path coming from quite different cultural contexts?
Yeah. For us, it was after a couple of years of writing about the young people that we had been meeting and putting it together as researchers and thinking ourselves in that way. And then, as we've been saying, there was just this strong desire to transition from, just thinking and researching to doing, to living in solidarity. But yes, there are tensions that come with that. This really did become acute when we went into the doing phase, and we were working on a project called I Believe in Love that was a website that existed to kind of help start a social movement to help young adults to reclaim lifelong love. And the model was that people would write stories about their, about relationships, about their aspirations and hopes and dreams for marriage and family and relationships and the things that they're learning. And then we on the ground were recruiting writers for it and helping to edit for these pieces. And also then the idea is helping to form kind of a community of writers who are going through this together. And so with that, we just there was something powerful about that, about seeing people write and share their stories and, seeing how that could help other people and the encouraging comments that came after they shared their stories and what that meant for the writer. But it also introduced, these tensions of, what about when we see things differently, than them when it comes to relationships? And there's these kind of, you could think of it as you have these college educated class, talking to working class about, here's how you should live your life. Here's the things you're doing wrong, and here's how you should live your life. And certainly that wasn't what we were going for, but you could easily see it becoming that. And so that was, how do we, what does accompaniment look like in a way that respects the integrity of the person, but that is also trying to help the person to name the challenges and what might help them to reach their goals? And so that process of accompaniment was, I think, filled with some tension.
And I think that, as David mentioned, when we were in the research stage, we didn't feel it as acutely, probably because we might have been kind of naive to these tensions and dynamics. So coming in, I think we suffered, as many young 20-somethings who are idealistic and want to do something good in the world. We suffered from a bit of a savior complex. We know what's wrong, and we know if you just change your beliefs and have the right ideas about love and marriage, you'll be able to have a good marriage like we do, and
20-somethings or people in Washington, D.C. I mean, a lot of us suffer from this.
I guess it's part of the human condition that we can have the illusion that we have things together and know what other people need. We definitely went through a process of being humbled when we actually tried to do the work of accompaniment, as David was saying. And so I think we became very much aware that our job is not to change other people, and that, in fact, what we saw kind of at the deepest level, like the root of a lot of this loneliness and pain, was people doubting their own dignity and just a self-loathing almost. We started calling it the screw-up phenomenon, because I can't tell you how many times somebody, after I'd get to know them, would tell me, how could anybody love me? I don't think I'm lovable. I'm just a screw-up. And that kind of sense of shame and self-loathing would manifest in a lot of different ways in relationships. And so we started realizing that when you're trying to, when you come in and there's this power dynamic and you're like trying to change other people, that just contributes to the doubting of one's own dignity. And really the antidote to that despair that comes from losing your sense of dignity is real participation and mutuality. So we just became really, we started to see that mutual relationship in which we are both contributing to a common project, and in which our cultures can be complementary with one another, that is the path forward to real healing in some of these places of brokenness.
And you saw the doubting of one's dignity that also comes from the stigma that gets attached to growing up in a working class town, and that, and so, I mean, the area where we live in Southwest Ohio, it's all, we live in it's mostly white. But then of course, in our town, it's solidly working class, but in the surrounding areas, it's suburban, the suburbs of Cincinnati. And so you have, lots of college educated and affluent families. And in the school district where our town is, you have both upper middle class kids and working class kids going to the same school. And one of the really unfortunate things is when the working class kids, end up going to the same school as the upper middle class kids, a lot of the working class kids would get called, white trash, just all kinds of horrible names. Like one kid, he told me, he said, growing up in the town, it was like, it was like Mayberry. It was, everybody was the same and it was wonderful. He grew up with his grandparents. But then he said when he went to the middle school where he met kids from the other part of town, the upper middle class part of town, he said, I realized, oh my gosh, there's class differences. He's getting bullied and so forth.
He said, apparently we were poor, which had not been a thought that occurred to him before.
Yeah, it hadn't occurred to him. But that's part of where the self-loathing and the questioning of one's dignity comes from as well. And it's not just from, going to school with other kids from a different class, but it's also, I think, in the larger culture. There's a kind of a narrative that hopefully is changing now. But, for a long time, you could get away with making fun of white working class people. And that has real consequences for people's sense of worth and dignity.
Very much so. Very much so. Yeah. Especially when things, as you kind of can start to see in our broader political discourse at a national level, especially when that condescension is also tainted with almost like a moral dismissal. I think it's like a very hard thing for the human psyche to heal from. Zooming out a little bit, I do see you both throughout your writing. I do see both of you as sort of humbly yet consistently standing in this very unique gap between some more influential national figures and initiatives. You have some relationships with people who have these broad perches and influence, public intellectuals, journalists, perhaps policymakers, and the world of sort of depolarization at a big level, and then your local community. How would you characterize the task of translation? What are some of the more common assumptions or misunderstandings of your community now that may emanate from the national elite perch, and conversely from your fellow Ohioans in your neighborhood and town and county, like towards the elites?
Yeah, well, I think we're always struck when we're not in DC or New York very often, but maybe once a year or something. And whenever we go, I'm always struck by how things that have become so familiar to us are so foreign to people on the coast. And I would say that I think ideally this role of translation, like of translator, that that wouldn't be necessary, that it would be like a temporary measure, but the real goal would be a system in which the voices of the people themselves are actually heard and considered to be important, and there's some sort of pipeline from parts of the country, the middle parts of the country, to those who make policy decisions. And so really like putting the voices of poor and working class people at the center. I think we became, like, you're speaking to your question of sort of like the difficulties. I think one of the things we became most uncomfortable with is being in that role of translator. Like it can just feel like, well, who am I to speak for this diverse group of people? And yet I can see the good of that.
So on the one hand, there's the stereotype of the white working class, because again, that's who we're talking about in our neighborhood, specifically the white working class. The white working class as deeply intolerant. And I guess what we would say is that, our experience from 2010 to, up to like 2016, when the white working class really, started making the news as Donald Trump was running for president, was that, and then even after and afterwards too, until now, our sense is that the young working class people that we know, we don't know as many older working class people, but the young working class people, they pride themselves on being deeply tolerant, and often, are working with, and even, are in relationships with people of different races or ethnicities. And it's something that, the stereotype of the white working class as being deeply intolerant is something that I think is offensive to many people, because it is something that they particularly pride themselves on many people that we know on being tolerant. So it was a conversation with a good friend of ours, Lance, who he and his wife, Tanya, they are just an amazing couple. They have 4 biological children, and then they adopted one child who was his parents were struggling with drug addiction, and so they adopted this child. Well, they already had 4 kids, and they're living in this small house, and then they adopted 2 other kids as well. So they have 4 biological kids, 3 adopted kids, and they live in a modest trailer. But there's always the sense of there's always room at the table. And it was a conversation with Lance after the 2016 election, in which I was asking him, he had voted for Donald Trump for president, and I was asking him what he hoped that Trump would accomplish. And the first thing he said he said, I hope that Trump can help to unify our country and that we can get along. Now, and for him, he was interested in talking with, he had a lot of questions, for instance, for Black Lives Matter activists. He wanted to know, what's your deal? What are you about? And he wanted to talk with people that were involved in that and ask them. And he had curiosity about that. And so it occurred to me as like, wow, like, there's this openness to the other, and that there's a lot here to work with. It's not just like this. I mean, yes, there are persistent, the issues of racism and xenophobia, and all those things are real, but there's a lot of goodwill to work with among people in the white working class. And so for me, that's always been inspiring, is just to encounter that wanting to not just talk tolerance, but to actually be tolerant of other people. So that's the one thing. And then, but on the other hand, with many of the white working class people, there's also this distrust of the government, and like not just that the government is incompetent, but that it is malevolent. Like, somebody said to us that she thought that the fentanyl crisis was the deliberate work of public officials and government to root out white working class people, to root out poor white people. And I mean, so that it's that kind of deep seated, not just distrust of somebody's competence, but of there's this sinister plot to wipe us out. that I think, of course, goes overboard. It doesn't quite comport with reality.
There's a quickness to assume that there's a conspiracy behind something that is probably more likely bureaucratic incompetence or just lack of knowledge of the problem. So,
right. Yes, welcome to, I would say, the second half of the 20th and now well into the 21st century. Bureaucracy and evil somehow, both sometimes I think the realities of both are together, and then sometimes the perception of evil is really just a bureaucratic, neutral, procedural error. As our listeners know, and those reading comment, we are seeking to understand social change, how it's happened historically, what might be required for visible, large-scale redemptive social movements to unfurl again in the context of today's complexity and pluralism. And we have some great essays. We have a very interesting one by Tyler Cowen, The Economist, sort of questioning why nonprofits, quote unquote, have become the assumed vehicle of social change. Somewhat in tension with that, we have a beautiful piece by another married couple, Chelsea and Josh Bombino, on this sort of oft-hidden role of spiritual motherhood. And actually, Amber, I have to give you a shout out because about a year plus ago when we saw each other last in person, you said you were talking about like femininity in public, and I've not stopped thinking about that like observation from you, and it sort of caused this commissioning of this piece on these hidden dynamics that perhaps they're a little bit more feminine in nature, that do birth things in the world, but they're often tend to be in the background, maybe less linear. And then we have this sort of more theological grounding from this theologian from Duke I mentioned earlier, Luke Brotherton, on how sort of a theology of conversion really needs to be the ground from which we actually even think about social change. And part of why I've always been so drawn to you both is that there is just this, I think, deep conviction in my own vocational autobiography that developed early in adulthood that somehow, as you come to believe certain things, the only way you really feel like those beliefs can be held with integrity is if you live into them fully with your life, sometimes at the cost of misunderstanding or unpopularity or countercultural, upstream moving, whatever, that we must be the change we seek in the world. And therefore, we must sort of maintain both a strength and a softness to be ourselves changed, even as we are seeking to serve others. And you've both kind of alluded to this in and out already in this conversation, but I'm curious how much this notion of conversion and sort of the radical mutuality you've already described in your relational work over these years, how does that resonate with you? And does it even maybe give you a prism or a framework or a paradigm to help even encourage even groups like Braver Angels or like really large scale initiatives or the nonprofit world that are, seeking all kinds of interventions? Might it be something you would encourage more of those in the professional do-gooder class to think about?
Yeah, that really resonates. And I just have to say, I'm very excited to look at this issue. It just arrived this morning. Our 4-year-old ran out to get the mail. He's obsessed with the mailman, and he ran out and he said, "Mom, a book came today," and he gave me the latest issue. It looks great. It looks so interesting. But yes, this insight about conversion. Part of our journey in the last decade has been that around 2016, we had a transition moment that was very challenging. And I would say that really from 2016 until about, a year and a half ago or so, we were having a lot of questions about, are we even living this vocation? Like what, just almost an identity crisis, really, because to be concrete about it, in 2016, our third child was born, and we were kind of wrapping up our work with the I Believe in Love project because David was about to start Braver Angels, and I had been discerning that I wanted to spend more time at home with the kids and just do some part-time writing. And that transition from working together with a very specific mission that was like integrated in, but it was like both a professional thing and something very personal to us. And then life without that became much more complex because we quickly realized that, sure, it's easy to be good neighbors and be intentional about reaching out across lines of division when it's your job, and someone's paying you to do it. But then when we became like an ordinary family living in our town, and David was doing work that I wasn't very involved in, very supportive of, but just I didn't have a job description there. And it was very humbling to see how isolated we could become from our neighbors, and how the things that we just kind of felt a bit hypocritical. Like, we talked this big talk, but it's really challenging as your family's growing to, like, what does it mean to live this life of solidarity as a normal person who's not being paid to think about these things and write about these things. And so that was humbling. But then also at the same time, we had some years of difficulty with each other. We just started fighting more. Just some resentment was building, I think, as we had moved from this really wonderful situation of working together and to just the responsibilities of life seeming to almost drive us apart from each other because we had separate responsibilities in many ways. And so that was also humbling, because here we had, had these beautiful ideals about marriage, and thought that, I suppose, assumed that we were somewhat invincible, although we would have never said that. But it was just, again, humbling to realize, wow, even us with like so many supports, marriage is still very difficult at times. And so thankfully we had like a wonderful counselor and lots of supports. And I think we've done a lot of really good marriage work in the last few years that we're very thankful for. But I've heard it said that, like, from your place of brokenness, that's where ministry springs, like authentic ministry, because of that vulnerability and ability to identify with other people who struggle. And I think that is true also. And just this idea that it's in our weaknesses that we are strong, and learning to like see those weaknesses with tenderness has been a part of the journey. David, do you want to say anything? I just said a lot about that.
So along the way, our mission, our kind of our sense of vocation kind of shifted to doing what we can to put working class people at the center of the conversation, speaking for themselves. And so that has become, I would say that's related to our conversion, because we've had this sense that, of our own kind of an inadequacy to, be good translators or, to aptly describe what is happening, and that there's this great need for people to be able to speak for themselves about the challenges that they're facing. And so, so for instance, could we imagine, a political culture in which, if you're going to make, legislation, let's say on housing assistance, for instance, one of the first things that has to happen is you talk to, low income, single moms receiving housing assistance about the challenges that they're facing, and about their ideas for what could be done to reform and make better the system. If you're talking about, how to strengthen apprenticeships, that, you would talk to blue collar people who are in the midst of that, who have gone through that, about, okay, what could be done here? What are your ideas? So, something like that, where we're hearing directly from people that we often don't get to hear from, in terms of, because they have a lot of ideas when it comes to, what could be done to improve some of these policies, to change them. And many people have a lot of experience born from their own challenges. And so, is there a way that we can tap into those experiences and those insights? And I mean, unless I'm missing something right now, it just seems like we don't have the infrastructure to really capture, the insights and the experiences of ordinary people on the ground like that.
Another way of putting it is that it's the norm for an office to work with a think tank to develop a policy proposal, but it should also be the norm to work with a working group of constituents, ordinary constituents with a stake in that issue. But I don't think we would have come to that level of, or come to that without this sense of the importance of conversion and seeing how there, but for the grace of God, go I, really being able to see that it's not that the people that we were interviewing are that different from us. We struggle. We're all human. And I often think about what St. Paul says about, the good that I want to do, I don't do. And the evil that I don't want to do, I do. And just, we get trapped in these same cycles. And so, yeah, this posture of being on the same level and working with pave the way to realizing the importance of the kind of thing that David's talking about.
Thank you. Thank you both for your transparency and vulnerability and sharing that. I think it's very relatable and in some ways perhaps necessary for the sort of purification of all of our vocations in these kinds of ways when you have this deeply missiological work that is also really all about discovering the shared human condition and discovering our shared humanity and what it is to live as equals. I think your discovery there, though through pain and a crisis, as you put it, unfortunately is part of our lot in life. In this piece on conversion that Luke wrote for us, he just has a simple line that, change for the better, whether you're talking in a society or in an individual or in an institution, always involves rupture and recovery, renewal and revolution. I want to just talk a little bit about Braver Angels, if you wouldn't mind. I guess this is mostly to be directed at you, David. Amber, I don't know if you have been that involved, and it sounds like maybe less so, although I'm sure you've been a constant conversation partner with David. In light of sort of this whole conversation, how does your helping to found Braver Angels with David Blankenhorn and others connect with all of this? How do you sort of see the connective tissue, and in what ways is it different?
Yeah. So, when we went from the transition from researching to doing, we, pretty soon began thinking about, okay, what's the common project? That there needs to be a common project that we're all working on. It can't be one class of people, just serving another class of people, or one category of people serving another category. We need a common project in which we're coming together, a diverse group of citizens, to tackle an issue, a challenge. So that, for me, was how I was thinking about Braver Angels and how I still think about Braver Angels. And the mission of Braver Angels is to bridge the partisan divide and to address the political polarization that not only affects relationships, but also means that we have gridlock, in our state houses and in Congress, and means that good things don't get done. So at the first workshop that I organized for Braver Angels, it was here in our town of Ohio. And, it was the kind of thing where it was the factory worker, sitting next to the doctor. And then, but as, Braver Angels took off, and the kind of people that just kind of naturally came to Braver Angels and had the time to volunteer and so forth, it was mostly college educated, upper middle class people. And that's where we are today at Braver Angels.
And sorry, David, to interrupt you, but what year was this initially?
So this was late 2016, right after the 2016 election is when we brought together the first group of people for a workshop.
It was Trump voters and Clinton voters that you brought together for a whole weekend.
Right. So it was 10 people who had voted for Donald Trump and 11 people who voted for Hillary Clinton, and we spent the whole weekend together.
Well, it's so funny. Just a side note, I remember the day after the election getting together with April Lawson, who has written beautifully for Comment about conflict mediation, and as you well know, has been involved in Braver Angels and is a mutual friend. And that was when she introduced me to basically the launch of this. And at the time, I naively, because I just assumed Braver Angels was all about blues and reds. And funny enough, I had you all in my head, and I said to her, this is the day after 2016 election, I said, April, I'll be curious how this Braver Angels thing works out, but I don't think it's just about blues against reds. I think this is about social class, and we should remember Amber and David Lapp. And I didn't know. I don't think somehow that you all were involved.
Right.
Anyways, the ironies.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the ways that you see how it is about social class too in the midst of this is, so the second workshop that we organized for Braver Angels, it was here locally in Ohio, and it was 8 blues, and so 8 people who lean Democratic and 7 people who lean conservative or Republican. And of the 8 people who lean Democratic, somebody else had a local leader in the Democratic Party had recruited most of those Democratic leaning people. But I had recruited 2 of them, and they were from my working class town. And they so happened to both be gay, white, working class guys. And so after that weekend workshop, it was a powerful experience. And I'm coming home from it, and I get a call from this local Democratic leader saying, hey, I heard that it was a powerful, wonderful workshop. I'm hearing great reviews, except that I heard that there were 2 people on the Democratic side that really didn't fit in, and I'm wondering why they were there. And the people she's referring to are the 2 working class guys, the 2 gay, white working class guys. You just, they're dressed a little bit differently. They're, they're different social class. And so it's larger. This is happening within one's own party. She
specifically said they weren't eloquent enough, correct? That they weren't good spokespeople for their side. For example, I think they had some differences of opinion about some benefit. I think something about welfare that came up, and they had a slightly different take on it than the rest of the group. And
the same thing, by the way, happened on the Republican side. Is there were in those early workshops, there was complaints about from some of the Republican people about some of the other Republican leaning participants that they weren't quite they weren't good spokespeople. So you see this happening within your own political party, the class divide. Yeah. So that is definitely something that is a part of the larger divide. I think it's part of the partisan divide, yes, but it's separate. So what I'm doing now with Braver Angels is I help to lead something called We the People's Project, which is a group of working class people within Braver Angels leading this project. Our tagline is where everyday Americans get time at the podium. And what we're really trying to do is put working class people at the center of the conversation when it comes to their experiences and their ideas for what could be done for solutions. And, again, as I was saying earlier, my dream would be that we help to build this infrastructure, right, where you have the insights of working class people, going directly to the state house or to DC, helping to shape legislation. And I think that can help us to transcend our present polarization, because part of our polarization is built on these, we're 2 parties just trying to defeat the other side. But when you get down to the reality of the problems, then you see, oh my gosh, people are experiencing the problems in a lot of the same way. Like, housing assistance is very complicated, and the income cliffs and stuff are really complicated. And whether you're a Republican or Democrat or independent, you experience that, and you have ideas for what can be done to fix that. And so that's where I really think that part of the solution to polarization has to be that we're hearing from a diverse group of people. In many cases, are going to be poor and working class, who can give insight to the challenges and then to the solutions.
Right. I do think a lot of people in the U.S. today are experiencing similar problems in similar ways, but with different cultural and different ways of talking about it, and sort of different cultural conditions. And I say that as a way to lead into, as you were talking earlier about accompaniment, which has become one of my favorite both words and practice, or just posture of life. In those I most admire, actually my very first issue of Comment back in 2019, when I came in as editor, I was able to commission and work with a wonderful weaver, really, who's originally from Mexico, but he has worked for many, many years with undocumented immigrants in Houston who have broken their backs typically and have spinal cord injuries, usually from construction projects. And so it's a very unique, essentially like community organized nonprofit, all made up of these disabled, undocumented immigrants. So they're kind of in a few different pockets of, if you're going to think about this on the conference circuit, they'll go to like conferences on disability rights and they're not quite fitting in totally because of their undocumented status. And then they'll go to undocumented, they don't actually go to conferences so much, but sometimes they do. But they really serve this organization has given so many of them a fresh purpose, and it's become a vital community to serve the city of Houston in particular when there's a natural disaster like Harvey or whatever. And long story short, Pancho Argüelles is my friend's name who wrote this piece for us back in 2019 on accompaniment. And on the one hand, it sounds like such a different context than the one you guys are living, but I just thought I would read these 2 paragraphs about accompaniment from him as a way of both closing here and just seeing if it resonates and encourages you. So I'm just going to read this. This is from Pancho Argüelles in comment in an issue we did on love versus fear in the fall of 2019. And this is him from his context. So he says, so what is accompaniment? This is about midway through the essay. Accompaniment, particularly with communities that have experienced the trauma of oppression and marginalization, is a process that starts by acknowledging the full humanity and dignity of the people we want to accompany, recognizing, also known as reorganizing our cognition, that there are systems of power, ideas, policies, beliefs, and attitudes that dehumanize some and privilege others is needed if we want to be able to join in the efforts of a community to transform its complex history and context. Accompaniment demands creating and holding the conditions for a dialogue among equals. We are challenged to suspend the certainty of our knowledge or expertise if we are to be open to listen, learn, and follow the leadership, e.g., information, knowledge, and wisdom of those who are expert survivors of the reality we want to transform. Accompaniment has a concrete material dimension of taking time and making an effort to displace ourselves and go meet people where they are. This means getting out of our comfort zone, walking to the encounter of the quote other, and making ourselves vulnerable to be challenged by them and their reality. In my experience, this is Pancho still, working in Chiapas, Nicaragua, and central Mexico, this literally meant walking for hours, sometimes getting stuck in the mud and rain and getting so tired that you started asking yourself what you were thinking when you chose to do this. Accompaniment often means being pushed to your physical and emotional limits. But at the end of this effort, the joy of having arrived at a community where you can eat, talk, and pray together is a reward and a reminder of why we started the journey, providing nourishment to begin again and work for a new day.
That's lovely.
It just came to mind as you were talking, and I wanted to offer that by way of just hopefully a naming a little bit of your own journey to date and ongoing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When about the time when we were transitioning from researching to doing, Pope Francis had become Pope and was talking a lot about accompaniment. And one of the things that he says that really resonated with us was that he said he has a dogmatic certainty in that God is in every person's life, that no matter how full of thorns and weeds a person's life is, that there's always a place for the good seed to grow. And I think that's relevant for, us as individuals, communities, our political culture in general. There's always a place for the good seed to grow, and that it's, through this process of radical mutuality and accompaniment, that I think we can let that good seed flower and, become something that blesses all of us.
And when you were reading that quote, it reminds me of a truth that human behavior usually makes sense, barring some sort of psychosis or something. But in general, when we look at somebody else's behavior and it doesn't make sense to us, there is a reason. We just have to change our own posture and listen to be able to understand what the reason for the behavior is. And I think that speaks to what it looks like to accompany someone else.
Well, you two are instruments of as much grace as you've ever been, maybe more than I even remember. So thank you so much for just sharing a bit of your own hearts and lives with me today and our listeners, and just really rooting for you and your neighbors and your friends and family for however many years we all have left.
And thank you, Anne, for the invitation to this conversation.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution. Check out this podcast's cultural and theological seedbed at www.comet.org, where you'll find imagination for a thriving society animated by the Christian humanist tradition, including regular writing by Alan Jacobs and other literary luminaries, The Welcome Table hosted by Greg Thompson, Zealots at the Gate, a feisty new podcast about religion and democracy featuring Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig, and a whole lot more. And consider getting involved in our growing Comet community. You can write, you can read, you can host a Comet supper in your neighborhood, or you can participate in a conversation with your fellow readers and an author. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comet.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comet Magazine, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.